She is a horticulture, agricultural, and natural resources extension agent for the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Being raised in Memphis and an urban area, she focuses on her horticulture, agriculture, and environmental education for small and disadvantaged communities. Her passion for community prompted her to address food system issues in urban areas, improving community health and access to fresh foods. Khadejah believes that sustainable agriculture is an investment in tomorrow and a powerful deterrent to poverty and food-related insecurity. Amen. So without further ado, I wanted to pass this on to Khadejah if she's ready. And it's so nice to be a part of this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you guys for coming. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Can everyone see my screen? Thank you guys so much for coming to Reclaiming the Legacy. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the power of Black farming in the United States. Just like she said, I'm Khadejah Scott. I work for the University of Florida. I got started in agriculture, using it as a way to help people alleviate poverty. And so for me, it's been really important to have the conversation related to Black people and the associations that they have in agriculture. You may have already had the opportunity to see the workshop description, but essentially the institutions of slavery and other exploitative labor regimes that persisted in the years after slavery have created a negative association with Black people in agriculture for generations. And so challenging the fundamental tenets of agriculture as we understand it and developing fresh alternatives are necessary so that we can end this negative association between Black people in agriculture. So Black people and the land. The past history of African American involvement in the United States began, of course, in 1619 with the first enslaved that were brought to North America from the colony of Jamestown to aid in the production of tobacco. So when the Cotton Revolution began in 1690, African Americans were the engine, unfortunately and pretty tragically, that caused the United States to be the greatest cotton producing nation in the world. After the Emancipation Proclamation, these former slaves didn't have money or animals or any materials or formal education. But what they did have of value was their knowledge. African Americans possessed an empirical knowledge about their cultural homeland from Africa, particularly West Africa, and the production of certain crops like cotton and tobacco, rice, as well as peanuts. European settlers who did not know how to grow rice or millet could not have achieved this production on their own. They relied very heavily on the skills of enslaved persons who brought the knowledge that they had about grains from Africa. African Americans have always had a deep reverence for the land and possessed great abilities in sustainable agriculture. And there's always been this very valuable relationship between Black people and the earth. Judith Carney, she's the author of a book called Black Rice. She talked about Black people working in rice plantations in South Carolina and how they helped create what was the most profitable economic economy of the 18th century. We've all heard that knowledge is power, oftentimes to the point where it's starting to seem like it's cliche, but sharing knowledge is very powerful, providing that education can give a person their complete control over their life. Knowledge can be passed from generations to generations, but it cannot be destroyed. And so as land-based Indigenous people, Black communities have always had a deep connection to the earth, with the land being a source of spiritual, economic, cultural, and community grounding. And so Black people have worked to build healthy, ecologically and sound connections with the land. So 40 acres in a mule, and we've all heard that phrase. With the knowledge of agricultural production, African Americans had seemingly the potential to really create one of the most profitable economies that was cultivated not through forced labor. Black farmers experienced several different abuses even after being emancipated, starting with the federal government's failed attempt at the 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule originated after the Civil War, when there was land available that was settled on by Black settlers that had been abandoned by white farmers during the Civil War. And so President Lincoln was actually commanding that 20 acres of the abandoned Confederate land be given to freedmen. That number was then increased to 40 acres, and they also agreed to loan army mules to freedmen. By 1865, about 40,000 formerly enslaved people were living on over 400,000 acres across the South. However, when President Johnson intervened, he ordered that all this land would be confiscated and then returned to its former owners, despite the fact that it had already been settled on by African Americans. So this is the first of several different practices that have severely restricted African Americans' access to land. Tenant farming and sharecrafting were pretty much essentially the only option that Black people had if you did not already own land. So those were the two only options that were available for non-land owners. And so in the South, there are almost 2 million tenant farmers by 1930. But even despite the tenant farmers and all of the discrimination, there is still a good bit of Black people that held land. Roughly about 15 million acres of land in the 1920s was owned by African Americans until around the 1930s when land snatching started occurring. So land snatchers, basically land that was already being settled on by African Americans was being retracted by the government through discriminatory practices. And so what people don't realize about land snatching is that you're not just taking the land, you're also taking, generational economic potential, cultural legacy, and familial ties when you remove people from their land. So across the 20th century, almost 600,000 Black people were forcibly removed from their lands. And then just discriminatory banking practices continued to target Black farmers on a regular basis. All the way up until 1975, when there were only about 45,000 Black-owned farmers in operation. So together, these incidents really pushed African-American farmers to the margins and pretty much obliterated their contributions to the development of modern agriculture. Scholars are still today wondering and trying to determine how the elimination of African-American farming from the current food chain is contributing to our food crisis and health disparities. There is a little bit of a reprieve because of the urgencies of these conditions and the historical disenfranchisement of Black people from our food system. It is very critical for Black people to reclaim, lift up, and strengthen the abundance of Black farmers and food justice work nationwide. Access to the land is crucial for achieving self-sufficiency. Owning agricultural land has helped preserve future generations and also helps ensure the security of our food system. For many years, Black farmers have protested and filed suits over discriminatory practices, and now the government is finally starting to recognize some of these injustices. A few examples, in 1999, 40,000 farmers got together and filed a lawsuit against the United States federal government relating to discrimination on farm loans. And then in 2010, President Obama repaid $1.2 billion to 18,000 farmers. And so things are starting to look up as the government is recognizing and trying to put more amendments and procedures in place to further benefit and visible of Black farms. So now we're trying to cultivate this Black farming community. As a result of the history of land theft and forced labor that we talked about, a lot of Black people have abandoned farming. The number of African-American farms has to increase in the United States. And one of the keys to doing that is going to be visibility. The visibility and representation are an essential way that African-Americans can start relating to the land and their culture needs that are being changed. So today's community of Black farmers is starting to recognize the past and understanding the importance of taking an active and direct role in the food system and trying to make it more inclusive and empowering and sustainable. Black communities have a very long history of resilience and self-determination and deep historical roots in Black food security. From culture to farming, to developing all these different systems of distribution and cooperatives, and even changing the culinary traditions of foodways across the United States. Black Power platforms continue to just help highlight prominent issues in our food systems. They're also helping us create strategies for alleviating food insecurity through Black farming. And so through farming, our communities have been rebuilt and connecting back to creating healthy produce and cultural heritage. And so now you've seen this trend as Black farms are starting to increase in number. There's more visibility in Black farming, and Black people are starting to reclaim this legacy and this understanding and this heritage that came with agricultural production in and outside of slavery. So how can we move forward? Now, all of that information, we recognize how important agriculture and self-sufficiency are. So what now? How do we move forward as a people with reclaiming this legacy? The first thing for me is visibility. And this list is compiled by several different social justice organizations in the United States. But visibility, we've got to keep showing up in numbers, especially when it comes to encouraging our youth about the attributes of agriculture and the benefits to our local food system. So just showing that Black farmers do exist, they exist in numbers, and trying to increase the ones that are not necessarily with us there yet. Secondly, we're going to be looking for action, working hard and making directives to encourage farming community, really trying to help cultivate an urban farming community, whether that's through community marches, visibility campaigns, or cooperation. There's a lot of talk within the nonprofit community and the academic community about cooperation, collective action, getting people to work together for the greater good of everybody. It's a lot easier to fight battles when you have an entire army with you. So cooperation between our establishments is going to be really important for cultivating this farming community. Calling political actions to political actions. There are several different amendments that have been put in place more recently that are designed to help encourage Black farming and alleviate the stigma and help remove kind of a gap that is seen between and access here in the United States. And so in order to kind of further that participation and increase that, it's very important for us to call on our political figures. Doing this through, writing to your governors, voting especially, paying attention and keeping abreast to new policies and procedures as they come out from the federal government is very important as we move forward to this urban farming community. And then lastly, supporting Black farming and food justice organizations. We talked a little bit about just how food access and Black farming are connected to food justice. There are several different organizations throughout the United States that are doing some really remarkable work towards providing loans to Black farmers and allowing them to purchase land, providing tools and technical supports. So organizations like Soul Fire Farm, the Black Food Justice Network, the Black Urban Growers Network, the Black Farmer Society are all different organizations that are truly putting in the direct action to make Black farming more visible and open opportunities and doors for Black farming in America. I've talked a little bit about just how the legacy was decimated of Black people in farming, but I'd like to hear a little bit more from you guys about why you think the stigma has occurred in agriculture and other ways to alleviate it. So I'd like to open up the floor and ask you guys a few questions. If you just want to talk back to me, you don't have to put it in the chat. So why do you think there is still a stigma around Black people and agriculture?
Hi, my name is Patty Allen. I'd like to take a crack at that.
Okay, great.
I actually am the descendant of a Black farmer who owned land. My great grandfather, who actually owned land in Illinois prior to the ending of the Civil War, and he was a co-founder of one of these small Black towns. And so I think about like what was considered being successful going back to after, because I don't even know how our family farm ended up in the little town called Stringville, Illinois. And actually, as a family member, researching that right now. But I'm just thinking about the progression of how it was considered that to be upwardly mobile, even in those times, you had to become educated, and in terms of book educated, academic educated. And I really think that is kind of stayed with us for a long time. Going to my, from my great grandfather, whatever, until me. And I think it's just kind of like how, and I think this is pervasive in American society, how we view how to create a successful life for ourselves. And I think the farming narrative right now has been, even going back to the 70s, farms fail, failing farms. So, if you want, that doesn't feel like an industry or a type of line of work that you would want to go into. And I think that was pervasive because we still garden, we farm. My father had no interest in doing stuff like that because I think he tied it toward that's kind of backbreaking labor. I prefer to be in my air conditioned office, and that's success for him. And farming did still, I think, carries that. It doesn't represent a vocation or a career that embodies, that represents something you can be successful in and prosper. And also, it also still signifies struggle. So that's my kind of 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think you make an interesting point. Oftentimes when we talk about removing the taboo that is Black people in agriculture, you hear us talking about, reclaiming the land, the power and self-sufficiency, the food security. But where you just mentioned talking about Black people and the stigma that surrounds it with just it not being seen as a science or technical education, that was a very interesting point that I think you brought to the table. Do you think that in organizations work to try to encourage Black people to be in agriculture, the definition of agriculture and it being successful needs to change as well?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, I think right now, I think it's changing as people, this whole movement of organic farming and people wanting to own land. I think those two ties are kind of taking, as you said, taking the stigma away from it. But I mean, did I answer your question? Because am I trying to unmute myself? I realized, okay, why am I supposed to, what was the question?
No, yes, I think you answered my question. But I thought you made a very excellent point when you talked about one of the reasons why people stray away from agriculture is the narrative around it being unsuccessful and not a lucrative career.
Yeah.
What I was asking you more is, so do you think one tactic that can be used for removing this stigma is to change, the conversation around how lucrative agriculture can be as a career? Exactly.
Yes. And that's why and that brings me back to me because I'm one of those people who have decided that, I spent 20 years, in a career behind the desk in an air-conditioned office. And I took some time off. I went off to England and did some woofing. And I got the farm. And because I had gardening, urban gardening, I had always been involved in it on a voluntary basis. But I really never had I'm going to do this for 5 days a week. And so I had 3 months and some money. I was able to go to England and spend some time on an organic farm because I wanted to live abroad too for a while, get that experience. And I just came back and I had the bug. I mean, it was just like, oh my goodness. And I just really think that understanding that being a farmer is the business, being a farmer is entrepreneurial, being a farmer is almost like being put in the younger kids' vernacular, being a baller, because it's just like being a CEO. You own your own enterprise, you know, and you can make so much determination about what you grow and whatnot. And so I don't know, I guess I think that based on my own experience, I realize how much more empowering, and it's not, and part of it is even just being a part of the motherland. I mean, oh my God, I kept saying, I'm finally in the cradle of mother, you know? A lot of us farmers say that, you know, we're with the mother and we have our hands in the land. That is so much more empowering to me now than having my fingertips on a MacBook, you know? So I think we're getting there, because I think I feel like we need to change the language around, maybe that would help, or change the understanding of what a farmer means. It's not this like the way my dad was like, well, who wants to do that back-breaking work, you know? But I don't know. I've had some pretty stressful, you know, long nights and long hours that feel more back-breaking to me mentally, being an office worker working for a white corporation, than the time that I was, you know, had my hands in the land and cradling the mother and tilling and sowing seeds. And I don't know, it was so much more empowering. And I think if people can actually just have that experience, I mean, wolf for a vacation, I think a lot of people will see that. And that's all. That's all But yeah, I've been converted. I'm not my dad's daughter. I think I'm more my great-great-grandfather's great-great-granddaughter, and that I am honoring his legacy. And he's an ancestor that's really speaking to me.
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. I'd like to hear from one other person about why they believe that there's still this stigma that's associated with ag and Black people.
If no one's going to jump in, I actually, as a participant, I'd love to just say a couple words. I think connection, just access to, you know, other Black farmers, you know, I think that would help incredibly a lot in the efforts. I think about like other industries and how you'll notice it's like, wow, a lot of this type of person is in this industry. And I think so, like that visibility piece that you talked about of, you know, seeing yourself in that is just, I think, incredibly important to inspire people to jump in more, and the connections and hearing their stories of like, okay, how did you do this? And it doesn't even, some of it doesn't even need to be as technical, but just what it meant to them. So I feel like that would help a lot with the stigma, is if we had more access to the people who are doing the work, since there is that you know, kind of disconnection, and there's so few. So I think we do need far greater access and just hearing people's stories. So I just want to.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is very well said. Just providing opportunities, I think, especially when it comes to the youth, so they have equal or equitable, not equal, access and abilities to start in these farming operations. Absolutely. So like is known, the majority of farm owners in the United States are white. What are some of the steps that should be taken to generate more diversity, inclusivity in farming? I think we kind of talked about them a little bit with the last question, but what are some other things that you are doing in your own life to make farming more diverse and inclusive? I'll start and give you a little bit of the background about myself. So like I said, I kind of got into the ag industry as a way of collective action. Prior to my employment at the University of Florida, I worked as a director of agriculture for an organization called Memphis Tilth. Memphis Tilth is a nonprofit dedicated to creating a local food system, specifically working in Black communities. And so one of the ways that I work to make a more diverse and inclusive farming community was by creating a farming academy for young Black people to enroll in. And so through that farm academy, I showed them all the things that you need to take care of a farm as far as farm planning, soil science, plant techniques, plant propagation, all those things. In addition, showing them how they can acquire land on their own for cheap and other things that are necessary and of value to encourage more Black people specifically to get in diversity and inclusive farming. Another interesting take that someone talked about earlier was by bringing more technology into agriculture. That way you can get more diversity into agriculture as well, by making more technologically advanced and more alternative enterprises in agriculture. You can encourage more young people, specifically more Black people, young people, to take place in agriculture, in farming. Does anybody have any else to comment related to this?
Thank you again, Khadejah, so much for being here. We really appreciate you presenting this afternoon. So thank you so much. So one example came to mind when you specifically asked this question. And I think honestly, this conference is really a great example of that, because honestly, the host of this conference is a majority organization. But the success that we have around the importance of bringing the history of Black farming to the forefront is important. And so working with a lot of organizations that have the resources that can really support a lot of the work that Black and underrepresented farmers are doing is really something that came to mind for me personally.
Thank you so much for sharing. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to add on this slide?
And I would say, I'm sorry, I don't want to just dominate the conversation, but I mean, I used to work for a politician, so I kind of have to say this. There's so much that we can do as citizens of this country, and making your voice heard, and people that are elected to office, hold them accountable and say, we need to change our policies that's going to support underrepresented individuals, because a lot of things that are happening, we know are intentional and they need to be held accountable. Change can happen.
Absolutely. And I think there's been plenty of organizations like Soul Fire Farm or Grow that have shown us that change is absolutely possible. And people are truly turning agriculture and changing lives and producing for generations and protecting their familial investments. So it's definitely important, and there is promise and opportunity out there for all of us. It's just a matter of educating people and kind of changing the taboo and the narrative and the associations, so people truly understand and respect the traditions that is agriculture. You know, our ancestors, as unfortunate as it is, they were taken for a reason. They possessed that knowledge, and that knowledge is passed down through us. So we have the capabilities, we have the knowledge. We just got to do a little bit more fighting to get to where we need to have the results that we should. But it is absolutely possible. This one, I like to just throw this out here. Like we talked about when we talked about the 40 acres and a mule and how Andrew Jackson rescinded that offer. But what if 40 acres and a mule was actually successful and freed African Americans, had their own ability to utilize land and their livelihood? How do you think the agriculture industry would be changed? You can even go as far as to say, how do you think society will be changed? Because as we know, all of society does depend on agriculture. So if one is modified, so is the rest.
So I would say, again, one thing that just came to mind is it probably wouldn't be so conventional in the fact that we know that agriculture is a huge, big business, but we would probably not be in a situation where there's so many genetically modified organisms and things to that nature. I think that we would see a lot more care for the land.
Yeah, absolutely. In my experience, majority of the small and disadvantaged farmers that I work with, they're typically doing alternative enterprises and specialty crops, regenerative agricultural practices, sustainable ag. So the farming landscape looks a lot different when you look at your small scale Black farms versus your larger scale commercial white farms. Yeah, absolutely. I used a few resources throughout this presentation as I kind of discussed the statistics about the farm project, as well as Andrew Jackson and 4 Acres and a Mule. So here are my resources. I'd like to thank the Agraria Center for Regenerative Practice for giving me this platform. Agriculture to me, like was said earlier, it really is an investment in tomorrow. And I think that there's a lot of power and privilege that can come from growing your own food. And I'd love to see that narrative change so that we can encourage more Black people and people of color in general to participate in agriculture for their future. So thank you guys so much again for coming and participating. I really appreciate it. My contact information is on this slide. So if you're interested in further collaboration or have additional questions, please just let me know. So thank you so much. Does anybody have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I do. It seems like you're like very connected to the farming industry. Are there any up and coming farms that you have seen kind of sprout out anywhere in the country that may be worth looking at and digging into? I know I saw that Soul Fire Farm in the chat, but just to kind of look at for inspiration for those just starting out.
Yeah, so for those just starting out, I'd also like to direct you to the University of Washington, D.C. They have an urban agricultural department, and they do some urban ag development with BIPOC farms that has a lot of really good information about how to get started. So is GrowDat. They're really good. They're based in New Orleans. And then the Black Farmers Alliance has an ongoing list of all Black-owned farms in each state. And so it provides you with their website, kind of like a little tidbit about what kind of practices they use, if they're regenerative, sustainable, stuff like that. And they'll give you all that information about them on that site as well. So definitely check those out if you're looking for more information about how to get started. And you're welcome to reach out to me at my work phone number or office too with any other questions.
Awesome.
I'd like to also make one suggestion. A lot of farms, including Black-owned farms, if you actually want to see a working farm, will have community volunteer days if you look on their website. And they range from small farms to larger farms. And that was the first time I ever participated in a community farm day was at Soul Fire Farm. And but I found out a lot of farms do this. You know, it's a way to open up their farm to a community for people to learn something. All the time people were coming from New York City to come to these events because they, you know, it was an opportunity to get access to a farm. But I just think community farm days are a good way to like expose people who want to learn more and kind of put their toe in the water. It's kind of a good experience, I think.
Yes, I completely agree. And like Ariella said, conferences like this are also good opportunities for exposure. I know a lot of them, like the one that the Black Urban Growers Network is doing, they include farm tours at the end of the conference. where you can actually go on their sites and ask them questions. So just different conferences that come up. It's the same thing with the National Black Farmers Association, as well as the National Women's and Agriculture Association. They all typically do farm tours and farm adventures. But I would be remiss if I did not tell you guys to reach out to your local extension agent's office. They always have information about the farms that are in your area. And so I'm sure they'd be able to coordinate with you a time that you could work with them to get a little bit more information about how to get started. So that's always a really good resource as well. But if that is all of the questions, thank you guys again so much. I appreciate you being here to speak with me. And thank you again, Ariella and Bethany, for your help.